The British Empire lasted over 300 years. It made Britain the most powerful nation in history. It also shaped a fundamental part of the British character. The Empire offered the inhabitants of a grey, damp island in the North Atlantic the prospect of limitless adventure. You might discover a diamond field and become unimaginably rich, or you might perish in a malarial swamp. Either way, the thing to do was to play up, and play the game. Wherever the flag was planted went a passion for sport and the spirit of fair play. But sport was about more than just good, clean fun. It was an entire way of looking at the world. And it was one of the foundations of the empire. In its wide open spaces, a particular kind of British hero was born. Exploring the unknown places of the earth, hungry for glory and adventure, courageous, intrepid, and ruthless. For the builders of empire, it was how you played the game that mattered more than victory, mattered more than life itself. To Britons in the mid-19th century, the heart of Africa was as mysterious and unexplored as the dark side of the moon. It proved a magnet for Victorian adventurers. They were drawn by an obsession to get there first, and to put new names to new places. On the 17th of June 1857, two Englishmen arrived in East Africa. Their names were Richard Burton and John Hanning Speke. They dreamed of finding what had eluded explorers for millennia. Where did the most famous river in civilization begin? What was the source of the Nile? The two men could hardly have been more different. Burton was 36 and already famous as a charismatic adventurer, a man who'd smuggled himself into Mecca disguised as an Arab, a man known for liking to charm snakes and wrestling alligators, a man who would eventually learn to speak 29 languages. He had a slightly sinister expression to his face, which wasn't helped by a scar on each cheek where a javelin had pierced right through his face. But it was the eyes that everyone remembered. One poet described them as having a look of unspeakable horror. His companion was his complete opposite. John Hanning Speke was clean living with a taste for tweed suits. But he shared with Burton the cast of mind that made the early pioneers of empire, an obsessive, often foolhardy determination. The pair came to loathe each other and would become bitter rivals. Together they traveled over 1,500 miles through swamp, desert, and jungle. For 2 years they journeyed into the interior, battling dysentery, fever, and wild animals, scorched by the tropical sun. You get a sense of how heroic this expedition was when you look at this 19th century map of Africa. They had landed on the east coast and various places around here, Madagascar, Zanzibar, Mozambique, and so on. They are known. But inside Africa, the whole heart of Africa is just marked unknown parts, thousands upon thousands of square miles. But somewhere in there was the source of the Nile. When Burton went down with malaria, Speke pressed on alone. And on the morning of August the 3rd, 1858, a year after they had set out, John Hanning Speke looked out on a vast expanse of water, which he immediately, of course, named Lake Victoria, and which he believed to be the source of the Nile. I no longer felt any doubt, he wrote, that the lake at my feet gave birth to that river whose source has been the object of so many explorers. It was no more than a hunch, though as it later turned out, he was right. Despite the fact his evidence was really pretty thin, Speke hastened back to camp and 6 weeks later was reunited with Burton. "I found the source of the Nile," he told him, to which Burton replied, "Oh no, you haven't." The two men agreed it would just be safest not to talk about it anymore, and for the remainder of their time in the jungle they maintained a frosty English silence on the subject. Victorian explorers like Speke and Burton were the pathfinders of empire, fanatical not for power, but for knowledge and excitement. And they helped to create the image of the classic British hero. Their accounts of their travels inspired tales of adventure for a British public hungry for excitement. King Solomon's Mines was published in 1885 and was a huge bestseller. Filmed many times since, it tells the story of 3 British adventurers who play the game to the hilt. Together they cross Africa in search of the lost diamond mines of an ancient civilization.
King Solomon's Mines.
Its author, Henry Rider Haggard, was an old colonial. He'd spent 7 years in southern Africa. The British public devoured his thrilling tale of danger and exploration. It came complete with a map of his hero's journey into the unknown. It's written in blood, a very good start, on a strip of fabric torn from a dying man's shirt. And it shows the route you have to take across the Kalakawe River, avoiding the bad water, between a couple of mountains called Sheba's Breasts, to the idols guarding the cave where the treasure is. In this quiet country house in Norfolk, Rider Haggard produced rip-roaring yarns for generations of schoolboys to read under the bedclothes. As well they might. His massively popular tale, She, comes with a powerful dash of Victorian male fantasy. She, or She Who Must Be Obeyed, is an African goddess, white as it happens, made immortal by killing her lovers. The narrator is at last allowed a peep at her extravagant charms. For a moment, she stood still, her hands raised high above her head, and as she did so, the white robe slipped from her down to her golden girdle, bearing the blinding loveliness of her form. I mean, this is enough to burst the buttons on your Victorian waistcoat, but what it does point up is the way in which the empire opened up the possibility of all sorts of intoxications that were quite unknown in respectable old England. For Rider Haggard's heroes, the Empire was a vast playground for a particular kind of British male. He's a fellow with a stiff upper lip, athletic and unpretentious. He is fair, he is honest, and he's steady. He's an amateur, and you can find him all over the Empire, from Khartoum to Calcutta to Cape Town. If you needed 3 words to sum him up, a decent chap. The decent chap was a contradiction. Sturdy and self-reliant, yet ready to obey orders without hesitation. He was nurtured in a place far removed from the heat and dust of the colonies, the English public school. The public school's heyday was the height of the Victorian era. Schools like this took boys and turned them into the governing class of empire, the future prefects of the colonial world. They couldn't expect an easy ride. Life in a Victorian public school was specifically designed to work against the comforts of family life. The chief thing to be desired, said one headmaster, is to remove the child from the noxious influence of home.